Chapter 6. CPI and the Big Lie. Newsflash, this just in. The CPI is a great big lie. I am talking about the Consumer Price Index, the running guesstimate by which the government tracks whether prices are going up or down in our economy, and by how much and in what sectors, and for which products and services, all with an eye toward divining what that might mean for economic growth and consumer behavior. As gauged officially by the CPI, the inflation boogeyman has been cast in the title role of Waiting for Godot. It never seems to arrive. There may be only one plausible explanation for why the CPI says inflation is tamed and has been limping along for years. For many years, the Consumer Price Index has been chronically lowballing true inflation and underestimating the real price increases that affect consumers' daily lives. Worse, the CPI's lowballing tacitly is intentional, a de facto conspiracy by the U.S. government, Wall Street, and corporate pension plans to restrain increases in benefits paid to retirees across America. When inflation rises, as tracked by the government's CPI, the recipients get a bump up to match it. It is called a COLA, cost of living adjustment, as my mother had to explain to me on that visit home in 1994, much to my chagrin. Take a more conservative approach that holds down the real rise in prices, and you tamp down the rising costs of Social Security and pension plans. Hold down the COLA, and the savings can stack up over the ensuing decades, compounding into hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars in benefits that the government won't have to pay out. This is pretty much what the government did in the 80s and 90s by fiddling with the components of the Consumer Price Index. This big lie may help the government's balance sheet, and it may extend the financial viability of Social Security for extra years, yet it means millions of older Americans are falling farther behind to the real increase in the cost of living every year. Social Security payments now total $1 trillion a year paid to 63 million Americans. This includes $720 billion for 47 million retirees age 65 and older, and another 10,000 Americans turn age 65 every day for the next 19 years. Technically, the age at which Social Security pays full benefits is 66 years and 2 months. In January 2018, the COLA was a 2% raise in monthly benefits, as if the cost of living for Social Security recipients rose only 2% in the previous year. That, of course, is bunkum. Try closer to 7%, and you are closer to the truth for many Americans. It is the increase in the cost of the life you live that should be your main concern. Whatever your cost of living might be, it is what it is. The bigger question is, what is the real rise in that base cost, and are your investments and earnings growing enough to cover that increase? Most wealth managers are failing to take this into account for their clients, and this makes my portfolio evaluation method, the CHIP score, all the more important to safeguarding your investments. It may be the only portfolio vetting regimen to take into account the individual investor's personal inflation rate, his COLA, and the rate of return needed to stay on pace with the rising prices in his life. If costs are going up 7% a year in your life, even as the CPI says the rise is 2%, pretty soon your purchasing power has plunged by 1/3. This spells disaster for retirees and the economy. Worse, many people are unaware of this erosion because they believe another government lie, that it will pay them a fair COLA to ensure their pension and Social Security payments keep up with the rise in their cost of living. This is so sad, and the effects show up gradually. Your parents stop taking vacations to Europe. The birthday gifts they hand out to your kids gets skimpier. A new look of worry haunts them. These people have no idea of the fraud that the government has perpetrated upon them. Wealth advisors and Wall Street are complicit in this looming crisis, owing to their ignorance about inflation and how to deal with it properly. We must find a better way to invest if we are to protect ourselves. That is the purpose of my CHIP score, and teaching you how to use it is the purpose of this book. Your investment advisor likely is insufficiently concerned about the COLA in your life and how to offset it in your portfolio. Your personal cost of living increase is likely to be running at 2 to 3 times the inflation rate claimed by the government, as reported in the Consumer Price Index. You must plan accordingly and ensure your investments can earn enough to offset the rising prices in your life. In tracking inflation and where prices are headed, up or down, and how fast they are going in either direction, the Consumer Price Index is based on a theoretical basket filled with not just food, but also products, services, fuel, and other basic costs of living, inputs numbering in the thousands. This is an enormously complicated and intricate undertaking, especially for a decades-old index struggling to keep up with radical changes in consumer shopping since the rise of Amazon and the steady demise of the American shopping mall. CPI's fundamental flaw, though, is that it seems secretly skewed and designed by intent to keep everything down to a dull roar. Most of the media coverage of the index seems rigged, too. Government economists exclude the volatile costs of food and energy and talk about core, read lower, inflation. Yet how many people can manage to exclude the costs of eating and driving from their lives? Statisticians smooth out the numbers and adjust for seasonal variations and changes in the year-ago numbers, yet if your monthly rent just jumped up 15% from last month to this month, you feel the impact instantly. No smoothing out is available for you. A dormant dragon. Still, we know that government tells all of us that inflation is tame, the dragon is dormant, and yet many of us know inherently that the CPI is understating the price increases we see in our daily lives. It is kind of like when you were 7 years old and you learned for the first time that the whole Santa Claus thing was one big lie, and everybody was in on it. The CPI came into use as a government indicator for the economy after World War II, and unions began tying wage increases in their contracts to CPI. In 1935, Congress passed the Social Security Act, beginning government payouts to retired workers in 1940. Workers started paying a payroll tax into a government trust, the Social Security Fund, content in knowing the money would be invested conservatively and the benefits would be paid out to them upon retirement. From 1940 to 1975, Congress boosted the monthly benefits that retirees received to offset inflation, generously granting 11 such increases in those 35 years, with the average increase around 5.7% per year. Thus, it was an annual raise of almost 6% every year for millions of recipients to keep up with inflation. In 1975, the Social Security payments began to be pegged to the increase in the Consumer Price Index, moving up in lockstep with the CPI each year. Now Congress wouldn't have to pass laws every few years to authorize an increase in benefit payments. It would be automatic. Makes sense, no? The government wanted to be fair to everyone. Inflation is a natural part of the economy, and it was in everyone's best interest that people get a little bump in their Social Security check to keep up. Automatic raises. This is one way deficits grow, decades later, on the good intentions of politicians seeking automatic re-election. In the 70s, the Social Security budget was small compared with that of today, so tossing in almost a 6% raise every year was no big deal. By 1980, however, the U.S. inflation rate hit a staggering 14.8% as measured by the CPI. In some ways, it was a warning sign that this could end up getting exorbitantly expensive. So in the 80s, ever so subtly, the Bureau of Labor Statistics began tinkering with the formula for the CPI, which had the effect of lowering the reported rise in prices overall. The Bureau switched from mathematical weighting to geometric weighting. automatically reducing the weight of goods that are rising in price. Furthermore, the Bureau began re-weighting components of the basket every 2 years instead of every 10, adding to wiggle room for adjustments and manipulation. By the 90s, the tinkering continued as inflation simmered at 3% or so, and the government had a rare bout of fiscal frugality, albeit a short-lived one. The Republican-controlled Congress suddenly focused with rat-like cunning on the deficit and how to cut it. It had begun dawning on Washington that the COLA was a ticking time bomb for entitlements. What if inflation and the CPI rocketed back up to 14% again one day? Payments to retirees would have to go up commensurately. These higher entitlement payments, every year compounded on top of the last one, would strain the already teetering finances of the Social Security program. The explosion in benefit payments would require big increases in payroll taxes or big reductions in monthly Social Security checks, and either path could get incumbents voted out of office. Thus, the feds and the big spenders in both political parties had reason to root for a CPI that claims inflation is as tame as it can get. How to make this happen? In the end, Washington politicians and bureaucrats cheated. In the mid-1990s, they changed how the CPI was calculated, so that the reported increase in the prices of goods and services was lower than what was really happening in the economy and in Americans' lives. This disparity between real price increases and CPI's lesser increases is so bad that our CHIP score portfolio rating system dispenses with the CPI numbers altogether. Instead, it uses an assumption that your personal inflation rate is double or triple the rise in the CPI, and your target for returns must be set accordingly. In fiddling with the CPI, government officials did so under the guise of aiming to make the CPI better at measuring inflation. 2 feet good, 4 feet better. At the time, some experts maintained the CPI was overstating inflation, and that fixing it to be more accurate could offer the benefit of bending the cost curve of Social Security benefit payments and other government entitlement programs. Curb benefit increases, and you can make the programs more financially stable. In January 1995, Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan testified to Congress and said the CPI was overstating the real rises in prices in the U.S. economy. This generated a lot of talk, and soon afterward, House Speaker Newt Gingrich was in the New York Times openly discussing how fixing CPI could have implications for lower spending on Social Security and provide maneuvering room for budget negotiations. Later on, he reportedly told a Clinton administration official at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, "If you could see your way clear to doing these things, we might have more money for BLS programs." Congress commissioned a blue-ribbon panel to study the matter and named Michael Boskin to head it. He had been chairman of the Council of Economic Advisers for President George H.W. Bush. In late 1996, the Boskin Commission report on the CPI came out. It argued that the CPI had been overstating inflation by 1.3 percentage points for decades, and recommended a rather startling downward adjustment of 1.1 percentage points in the reported CPI for 1996, of 3.3%. The Boskin report singled out a key flaw in the CPI. It lacked an ability to reflect the substitution effect. This is the notion that a person who eats steak will trade down to hamburger, or chicken, as the Boskin report cited, when the price of steak rises too high. Thus, the switch to a cheaper protein should count as being deflationary, because it cuts the inflationary effects of a price rise for steak. To me, this is flawed logic. If the consumer must trade down and no longer can buy his favorite ribeye, he is settling for a lower standard of living to offset the effects of his rising costs. How can this be a good thing that holds down the inflation rate? It fails to reflect the retreat of our giving up things we used to enjoy because we have lost too much purchasing power. One purpose of the CHIP score is to give you an instant reading on whether your financial advisor has designed your portfolio with COLA in mind, aiming for returns that can offset prices that are rising a lot faster than the CPI will admit. The fix is in. Up until this time, the CPI had been based on a fixed basket of the same goods and services tracked monthly, comparing their price changes without regard to whether consumers had shifted their purchases to a cheaper item. This fixed basket approach has been the preferred method of producing a pricing index since the 18th century. Using a fixed basket, the CPI measured what was happening to the cost of maintaining the same standard of living. Revising the CPI to be more of a substitution-based index reduced the reported rise in prices and became more of a subsistence index. As my economist pal John Williams put it in an article in 2004, cost of living was being replaced by the cost of survival. The old system told you how much you had to increase your income in order to keep buying steak. The new system promised you hamburger and then dog food, perhaps, after that. An ensuing backlash killed any chance that Congress would act officially on the CPI, but the BLS quietly began fiddling with the system to the same effect, shifting from a fixed basket of goods to a morphing basket based on more of a substitution-oriented outlook. The plan was to reduce cost of living adjustments for government payments to Social Security recipients, etc. The cuts in reported inflation were an effort to reduce the federal deficit without anyone in Congress having to do the politically impossible, Williams continued. The CPI underwent various revisions so that today, even if prices really were rising 10% or more annually, the increase would appear as if it were only 3.5% or so. Williams has argued that the CPI understates real inflation by 7 percentage points because of redefinitions and flawed methodologies. These changes, together with earlier adjustments in the Carter and Reagan administrations, have reduced current Social Security payments by roughly half from where they would have been otherwise. That means Social Security checks today would be about double had the various changes not been made, Williams wrote. This absolutely stuns me. Our own federal officials and politicians conspire to cheat retired Americans out of the COLA increases that might have let them avoid making sacrifices in their lifestyle, such as trading down to hamburger from filet mignon. My mother struggled with rising prices in the closing months of her life, and other aging women are in danger of outliving their money and losing ground to inflation every year. I created the CHIP score to help them avert this unfortunate financial fate. The big lie of the CPI creates a massive reality distortion field. In addition to invisibly reducing the rise in COLA for Social Security payments, this ineffective CPI recalculation also restrained increases in pension plans for government workers and private sector retirees, and in wages and benefits for union contracts, especially for government workers. Wages have gone almost nowhere in inflation-adjusted terms, and one thing constraining wages is the widespread and misinformed belief that inflation in the economy is moribund. Also, the lower-skewed CPI reassures and soothes the markets and the masses. The public's forward-looking expectations then can continue to be that inflation will remain low, because that is what the numbers are telling us. And remember, expectations are everything to the Fed. The positive feedback loop continues. Consumers' unchanged consumption patterns and stable expectations let the Fed stop worrying about inflation and forego raising interest rates too much, which otherwise can hamper business expansion. This cheers the markets, and a month later comes the next CPI report, and the cycle renews. CPI's understating price increases offers still another upside for policymakers. It lowers the GDP deflator, the measure that government economists use to calculate real GDP growth after discounting inflation. Thus, GDP growth looks stronger than it really is. This unreality also boosts stock prices. If inflation is low, then the interest rates paid for borrowing can be lowered too, and the acceptable price-to-earnings ratio, PE for stocks, can be higher than it would have been otherwise. Price-to-earnings ratio is a way of valuing and comparing all stocks. To buy a share of Amazon that will earn all of, say, $7 a year, you have to pay roughly $1,800 for a price-to-earnings multiple of 257. The average PE is around 18. As a rule, when the interest rate on borrowing is 5%, the equivalent PE ratio for stocks is 20. When borrowing costs only 2.5%, the buyer can pay more, and a stock's PE could be 40 and still seem reasonable. To illustrate, you borrow $1 million at 5% interest annually to buy a business that earns $50,000 in net profit per year, just enough to cover your interest payments. If you could borrow at 2.5% to buy that same business, you now could pay up to $2 million for it and still cover your interest payments of $50,000 per year. Also, low inflation, as stated in the CPI, lets bond issuers pay lower interest rates overall. Rising interest rates cause the PE ratio on stocks to go lower, in part because stock values must compete with the now higher bond rates. In perpetuating this big lie, government officials and their economists and our elected representatives mean well. If the tamped-down CPI spawns good economic sentiment, it helps the economy generally, which helps keep up good economic sentiment, which then keeps helping the economy grow. At some point, the official number is the official number. It's what everyone believes. The CPI is the instant temperature reading that connotes sickness or health of the economy. This flawed and much-watched metric may be a fantasy, yet if everyone believes it, it is every bit as real as reality is real. The problem for consumers is that real costs are going up, maybe 3 times as much as the newly redesigned Consumer Price Index says they are going up. So worker wages are lagging behind, hurting consumer purchasing power for workers and retirees alike. Lower-income and middle-income folks are working harder than ever. A lot of them have trouble covering monthly expenses, and most of them lack a savings cushion of 3 to 6 months' pay. When they reach a certain threshold of pain, they will do what they must to survive. They will take an extra job, lean on the government for a subsidy, take out a payday loan, borrow from a family member, or pursue any number of solutions. Thus, while federal officials think they pulled a fast one by manipulating CPI and trimming benefit payments by hundreds of billions of dollars over decades, they just end up paying the same tab in other ways. More of the working poor get on food stamps because their employers aren't giving out good raises, and the Medicaid rolls grow larger than ever as the costs of health care soar. The biggest losers in the mass delusion induced by the government's Consumer Price Index are retirees. The lowballing of the CPI by our government, all but lying to us and maintaining that prices are increasing a lot less than they really are, means millions of people are falling farther behind every year. The sluggish, barely visible growth in wages in the U.S. over the past 20 years is another outcome. Taking a double hit. A Social Security recipient takes a double hit. First, the monthly benefit payment will be lower than it otherwise would be if the CPI did a better job of capturing the full rise in prices in the economy. Second, the returns on his investment portfolio are less robust than he realizes, so that a 10% return really might be a 3% return after deducting his personal inflation rate. So when you hear in the media that workers' wages are failing to keep up with inflation, the reports are more right than even the reporters realize. Even now, government officials are eyeing still other changes in how the CPI is put together, and these changes might further drive down the reported price increases in the economy. Currently, the Bureau of Labor Statistics tracks 3 separate price indexes: CPI-U, the price index for urban consumers; CPI-W, for all wage earners and clerical staff; and the newest one, CPI-U, for chained CPI for urban consumers. The Bureau began tracking CPI-U monthly in August 2002, and this is the one to watch for what the government may do next to further lowball the rises in reported CPI. CPI-W for wage earners is the metric used for Social Security COLAs, and in recent years there has been talk of switching to chained CPI as the main standard. The idea was resurrected when President Obama's administration proposed switching to chained CPI, but got shelved. Surprise! It turns out CPI-U produces an even lower inflation rate than CPI-W does. While the CPI-W and the CPI-U come out monthly and are official instantly, chained CPI comes out monthly and is then revised quarterly, so that each reading becomes official only a year after it first came out. This has the effect of smoothing out price movements and further easing the impact of the real price increases going on in the economy. The Bureau argues that CPI-U is a closer approximation of real inflation. It is another ruse masking a cut in the payment boosts, the cost of living adjustment, that Social Security otherwise would have paid. Officials admit that CPI-U pegs price increases as being even smaller than the rises claimed by the other 2 indexes. For the 12 years through 2013, the inflation reported by chained CPI was 2.14%. CPI-U was 2.33%. That is an 8% lower inflation rate, and 8% of $1 trillion in Social Security payments annually would amount to an extra $80 billion saved per year, compounded for decades. That is $80 billion a year in benefits that never would make it to Grandma and Grandpa, just by the sleight of hand of moving from CPI-W to CPI-U. As the economist John Williams noted a few years ago, the CPI-U looks again like it has a strong chance of being used as a new federal parasite to drain consumer liquidity. Like a vampire bat that sucks only enough blood for self-nourishment, leaving its victims alive for further abuse, the use of the CPI-U as a cost of living adjustment, COLA measure, is designed to suck real disposable income from the limited cash flow of Social Security recipients for the benefit of politicians who do not have the guts to vote against Social Security. For higher income earners, this means lost purchasing power by the day, and your financial advisor is ill-equipped to help you do much to stop it. The CHIP score will let you rate your portfolio and your advisor, and examine the most important elements of your account. Even the biggest Wall Street firms have neglected to train their agents to focus on their clients' personal inflation rates. So how can they know what rate of return you need to stay out in front of the real price increases affecting your life? If they don't know that, how can they be making your life better? They aren't. They are making your life worse. Financial advisors rarely mention the CPI or inflation unless the portfolio they put together for you has a bad year. If your account goes up only 3%, they will say, "Hey, everything is fine. You are in a very safe portfolio, and the CPI only went up 2% this year, so you didn't lose purchasing power." That is another big lie.